They asked him to leave at 9:14 p.m. By 9:47 p.m., the entire airport would understand who he was. But in those 33 minutes between humiliation and recognition, something far more important would be documented. A system revealing exactly what it was designed to do. This is that story. And if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in a space you had every right to occupy, you need to hear what happens next. Because what Elias K. Mensah did in those 33 minutes wasn't about revenge. It was about making the invisible visible. And it's a lesson every single one of us needs to understand before we unconsciously become part of the same system that tried to remove him. The Sky Pavilion at Meridian International Airport existed in that rare altitude where money stopped making noise. 3 floors above the main terminal, accessible only through private elevators that required electronic authorization to even call. The space hummed with the particular silence of institutional power. Muted gold lighting reflected off polished travertine floors in patterns that suggested water without movement. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls stretched 40 feet high, offering unobstructed views of the runway, where private jets queued like expensive chess pieces awaiting their turn. The furniture, leather seating clusters arranged in carefully calculated groupings, sat empty in some areas, occupied in others by people whose body language suggested they'd never questioned whether they belonged anywhere. The air carried traces of bergamot and white tea from diffusers positioned at intervals only an interior designer would notice. A Steinway grand piano occupied the western corner, its polished black surface reflecting the recessed ceiling lights in perfect mirror symmetry. Everything in the space had been designed to communicate a single message: exclusivity without effort, privilege without announcement. It was 9:12 p.m. on a Thursday evening in late autumn. Elias K. Mensah stood near the eastern glass partition, 20 feet from the nearest seating cluster, his posture upright but relaxed. He was 47 years old, though his face carried that quality of timelessness that comes from genetic blessing and disciplined self-care. His skin was deep brown, darker than the charcoal blazer he wore over a white dress shirt with no tie. His shoes were black Oxfords, quality leather, recently polished, worn with the comfortable confidence of someone who had walked through many elite spaces before this one. He held his phone face down in his left hand, screen dark. His passport remained tucked under his right arm, its navy cover visible against the white of his shirt. A single carry-on bag rested beside his right foot, black ballistic nylon with leather trim, showing the subtle wear patterns of frequent international travel. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He didn't scan the room with the nervous energy of someone uncertain about their welcome. He simply stood, observing the space with the kind of stillness that suggested complete comfort with his own presence, even if no one else in the room recognized it yet. Around him, the Sky Pavilion's Thursday evening population moved through their pre-departure rituals with practiced efficiency. A man in his 60s, silver-haired and wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, spoke rapid German into a Bluetooth earpiece while gazing out at the runway. 2 women in their 40s, both in tailored business attire, sat at a corner table comparing notes on tablets, their conversation conducted in those hushed tones that respected the space's acoustic expectations. Near the bar area, a younger man in tech-casual clothing, expensive jeans, designer sneakers, a blazer that cost a fortune to look so deliberately relaxed, sipped champagne from a crystal flute while scrolling through his phone with his free hand. Everyone here had been invited. Everyone here had passed through some verification process that confirmed their right to occupy this particular altitude of privilege. Everyone here belonged. Except, apparently, him. The attendant who approached at 9:14 p.m. was young, perhaps 27, with dark hair pulled back in a style that managed to suggest both efficiency and softness. Her uniform was slate blue with subtle pinstripes, the fabric quality immediately distinguishable from standard airport staff attire. The Sky Pavilion logo was embroidered in silver thread above her left breast pocket. Her name tag read Sarah Chun, in elegant sans serif lettering. Her smile was professional in that particular way that exists at the precise intersection of service and authority, warm enough to soften commands, firm enough to ensure compliance. "Sir," she said, her voice pitched to carry without echoing in the acoustically perfect space. This area is restricted to invited guests only. She didn't ask his name. She didn't request his credentials. She didn't say, "May I verify your access?" Or, "Could you show me your invitation?" Her eyes had already completed their assessment. From his understated shoes to his worn carry-on to the absence of the distinctive platinum access card that all Sky Pavilion guests received during check-in. A card currently absent from his hands, his pockets, or anywhere visible on his person. The conclusion was immediate. The assumption was complete. He didn't belong. Elias turned toward her slowly, his movements deliberate, and when his eyes met hers with a directness that was neither aggressive nor submissive, something in the air changed. Subtle as a temperature drop, significant as a door closing. "I'm aware this area is restricted," Elias said, his voice deep and measured, carrying an accent that suggested East African origins softened by years of international education. "That's precisely why I'm standing here." Sarah's smile tightened by perhaps 2 millimeters, a micro-expression that happened below conscious awareness but registered nonetheless. "I'll need you to step outside the lounge, sir. The main departure area has seating available on the second floor. You can wait there until your boarding time." She gestured toward the elevator bank with her right hand, the movement economical and practiced, designed to guide without the presumption of physical contact. 3 people turned to watch. The German-speaking executive paused mid-sentence, his attention shifting. The 2 women with tablets glanced over simultaneously, their professional conversation suspended. Near the bar, the man in expensive jeans set down his champagne glass with a soft clink that seemed louder than it should have been in the suddenly attentive silence. Elias didn't move toward the elevator. He didn't move at all. "Have you verified my access status?" "Sir, all authorized guests receive their credentials during check-in at the ground-level Sky Pavilion desk. If you don't have your access card—" "I didn't say I don't have access," Elias interrupted gently, his tone remaining even. "I asked whether you verified it." Sarah's weight shifted from her back foot to her front foot, a subtle recalibration of authority that happened instinctively when compliance wasn't immediate. Security protocols require all guests to display their credentials upon request. Without your access card visible, I can't permit you to remain in this space. "I understand security protocols," Elias replied. He reached into his blazer's inner pocket with deliberate slowness, the kind of movement designed to communicate cooperation while maintaining dignity. He produced a slim black envelope, the paper heavy stock with a texture visible even from several feet away. "This contains my verification." He extended it toward her at chest height, requiring her to take a half-step forward to accept it. Sarah took the envelope but barely looked at it. Her training had already completed its categorization. Unattended individual presenting in the space, no visible credentials, polite but persistent demeanor. The envelope felt like an excuse, not evidence, the kind of thing people produced when they were hoping documentation might substitute for legitimate access. "Sir, this really isn't necessary," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone customer service professionals use when they're being patient with someone who's making things harder than they need to be. "If you'll just—" "Ms. Chen." Elias's voice remained even, but something in his tone made her pause. Not aggression, not threat, but a quality of certainty that didn't match the narrative she'd constructed. "I would appreciate if you would review what I've given you before making your final determination." Behind Sarah, a supervisor was already approaching. His movement across the travertine floor was purposeful but not rushed, the gait of someone accustomed to resolving situations before they escalated into problems. He was taller than both Sarah and Elias, perhaps 42 years old, with the bearing of someone who had worked in luxury hospitality long enough to read social situations in seconds. His uniform was similar to Sarah's but with subtle differences that communicated rank. A different shade of blue, additional insignia on the collar, a name badge that read Daniel Reeve, Operations Lead in slightly larger font. His expression carried the careful neutrality of a professional arriving to manage a developing situation. Not hostile, not friendly, simply present with authority. "Is everything all right, Sarah?" Daniel asked, though his eyes were fixed on Elias, conducting their own rapid assessment. "He doesn't have clearance," Sarah said. and there was a note of relief in her voice at the backup, at the arrival of someone with more authority to enforce what she'd initiated. Daniel nodded once, his evaluation complete in the space of a breath. The absence of visible credentials, the worn carry-on, the polite resistance. The pattern was familiar. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the VIP area. This space is invitation only, and we need to maintain security standards for our registered guests." Elias looked at Daniel for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no indignation, no defensive bristling, just patience. Deep, practiced patience that somehow felt more unsettling than protest would have been. "I understand your concern," Elias said quietly, "but I do mind being removed without proper verification. Multiple people have now approached me, and not one has actually reviewed the documentation I've provided." Daniel's jaw tightened fractionally. A tell that suggested his professionalism was beginning to give way to irritation. "Sir, we've asked you politely. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything difficult," Elias replied. "I'm requesting that you verify before you remove." "Verify what?" Daniel asked, his tone sharpening. "My authorization to be exactly where I'm standing." The words hung in the air with unexpected weight. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of frustration. "We can't just let anyone stand in restricted areas because they claim." "Anyone?" Elias repeated softly, and somehow the single word carried more meaning than the full sentence that preceded it. The atmosphere in the Sky Pavilion shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but several more people were watching now, their attention drawn by the tension in Daniel's posture, by the unusual sight of someone being questioned in a space where questions were rarely necessary. Daniel reached for his radio with practiced efficiency, his thumb pressing the transmit button as his eyes remained locked on Elias. "Operations, this is Reeve. I need security to Sky Pavilion immediately. Code yellow situation." The security officer arrived at 9:16 p.m., exactly 2 minutes after Daniel's call. His name was Marcus Webb, according to the badge clipped to the left side of his black tactical vest. He was taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders, with close-cropped hair and the physical presence of someone whose job occasionally required force but who had learned to lead with calm authority first. His hands rested naturally near his duty belt, positioned in that neutral ready stance that could transition to action in seconds if necessary. But his eyes betrayed something his posture didn't: uncertainty. Marcus had responded to dozens of situations in this airport: belligerent passengers, medical emergencies, lost children, confused elderly travelers, occasionally someone having a mental health crisis. He knew the rhythms of conflict, the patterns of people who didn't belong trying to access spaces above their clearance level. This felt different, wrong in some way he couldn't immediately articulate. The man standing near the glass partition wasn't aggressive, wasn't drunk, wasn't creating a disturbance. He was simply present, calm, unmoved by the escalating authority being brought to bear on him. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of law enforcement training, "I need you to come with me." Elias turned to face him fully, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other. Marcus with his tactical gear and official authority, Elias with his understated blazer and perfect stillness. "Officer Webb," Elias said, reading the name badge aloud, and somehow that simple act of acknowledgement, of seeing Marcus as a person rather than just a uniform, changed the dynamic slightly. "Before I do, I'd like to ask you something." Marcus's right hand moved fractionally toward his radio. Not a threat, just instinct. "Sir, we can talk while we walk. Did operations brief you on the situation before you arrived?" The question landed awkwardly, catching Marcus off guard. He glanced at Daniel, who stepped forward quickly. "That's not relevant. What's relevant is that you're being asked to leave a restricted area by authorized personnel." "By whom?" Elias asked. "Based on what specific policy?" "Based on the fact that you don't have access credentials," Daniel said, his voice growing firmer as professional courtesy gave way to professional authority. "This is a secure facility. We can't allow unauthorized individuals to." "Unauthorized," Elias repeated, as if testing the word's weight on his tongue. Officer Webb, has anyone determined that I'm unauthorized, or have they assumed it? Marcus shifted his weight. The question was more complicated than it should have been. Around them, the atmosphere in the Sky Pavilion had transformed completely. What had been a space of casual luxury 30 seconds ago now felt like a theater, with performers and audience taking shape organically. The diplomat had ended his phone call entirely and was watching openly, his German conversation abandoned. The two women with tablets had set their devices down, their attention fully captured. The man in expensive jeans had moved closer, no longer pretending disinterest. Near the piano, a younger woman, perhaps 30, wearing designer athleisure that probably cost more than most people's formal wear, had discreetly pulled out her phone. She held it low, angled carefully, but the telltale white light of an active camera was visible on her screen. She was recording. Sarah noticed it at the same moment Daniel did. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Daniel's jaw clenched, but neither of them moved to stop it, because stopping it would confirm that something worth recording was happening. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice softer now but no less firm. "We've asked you politely multiple times. You have," Elias agreed. "And you've declined to verify the documentation I provided multiple times." Daniel pulled the black envelope from where Sarah had been holding it. She'd been clutching it unconsciously, forgotten in the escalation. He opened it with more force than necessary, the heavy paper making a sharp sound as it unfolded. Inside was a single sheet of cardstock, cream-colored, with text printed in elegant typography. At the top, embossed in silver foil, were the words, "Global Infrastructure Summit, Restricted Access Authorization." Below that was a seating diagram showing the conference hall layout. Names were printed beside specific seats, indicating reserved positioning for keynote speakers, panel leads, and executive sponsors. Daniel scanned it quickly, his eyes moving over the names and titles. His breathing changed, shallower, faster, a physiological response to information that didn't match expectations. Near the center of the diagram, one name was printed in slightly larger font than the others, Elias K. Mensa, Pancontinental Transit Consortium. Daniel stared at it for 3 seconds. 4, 5. "This doesn't mean anything," he said finally, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Anyone can print a document." His radio crackled, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Operations, be advised. Social monitoring has flagged Sky Pavilion location. We're tracking an active live stream with rising engagement. Current viewer count 3,200 and climbing." Daniel's head snapped toward the guests. The woman with the phone met his eyes briefly before looking away, but her screen was still glowing, still capturing everything. Marcus cleared his throat, uncertainty now visible in his posture. "Sir, if you have legitimate access, then let's verify it properly through official channels. Come with me to the operations office and we can—" "Why?" Elias asked, the single word delivered with perfect calm. "Why what? Why should I go anywhere? I'm standing in a space where I have authorization to be. The verification you need is in your hands. The error isn't mine to correct." The logic was simple, undeniable, and somehow more devastating than any confrontation would have been. Daniel's face flushed. "Sir, you're being argumentative." "I'm being precise," Elias corrected. "There's a difference." The diplomat stepped forward suddenly, his expensive shoes making no sound on the travertin. "Excuse me," he said, his English accented but clear, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to international negotiations. "But I believe I recognize this gentleman's name from the summit documentation. I attended last year's conference in Geneva. If this is who I think it is, perhaps you should verify with event coordination before escalating further." Daniel turned to him sharply. "Sir, I appreciate your input, but this is a security matter." His radio crackled again, more urgent this time. "Operations lead, airport leadership is requesting immediate status update on Sky Pavilion incident. Deputy Director Reeves is monitoring the situation remotely, requesting your immediate response." The color drained from Daniel's face like water from a broken glass. Elias checked his watch for the first time. A simple Timex with a leather band, worn on his right wrist. "The summit begins in 22 minutes, he said quietly. "I suggest you verify quickly." Around the room, phones buzzed simultaneously. The live stream notification had spread. People were checking Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone slightly and said to no one in particular, her voice carrying in the sudden silence, "Holy shit, this has 5,000 viewers now." At 9:19 p.m., the Sky Pavilion no longer felt like a private sanctuary. The lighting hadn't changed. Still that carefully calibrated amber glow designed to make expensive things look even more expensive. The ambient sound system still played its curated classical selections at precisely modulated volume. The temperature remained a perfect 70 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by climate control systems that cost more than most cars. But the space itself had transformed from a place of exclusive privacy into something far more volatile. A stage where power dynamics were being documented in real time by thousands of unseen observers. The woman filming wasn't even pretending discretion anymore. Her phone was raised openly now, held at eye level, capturing everything with the steady hands of someone who understood she was witnessing something significant. Beside her, another guest. A man in his 50s wearing a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, had opened his laptop and was typing rapidly, his fingers moving with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to live blogging events. Hashtags were forming across platforms. Hashtag Sky Pavilion Incident. Hashtag Airport Racial Profiling. Hashtag Business While Traveling. Daniel's radio erupted with overlapping transmissions, different voices from different departments all trying to understand what was happening in the space 3 floors above the main terminal. "Operations, this is Central Command. We need immediate clarification on the individual's identity. Run full verification. Name Elias K. Mensah, MENSAH, through Summit Registration Database, VIP access lists, and executive sponsor records. Priority 1. Copy that," Daniel replied. His voice strained in a way it hadn't been 5 minutes earlier. He turned to Marcus, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent nearby guests from overhearing. "Stay with him. Don't let him leave the area, but don't..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Don't escalate to physical contact unless absolutely necessary." Marcus nodded, but he didn't step closer to Elias. Something in his training was telling him that escalating to any kind of physical positioning would be a catastrophic mistake. Sarah had backed away from the confrontation entirely, retreating to the reception desk near the elevators. Her hands were clasped in front of her in that particular posture customer service professionals adopt when they're simultaneously trying to remain professional and process the growing realization that they may have made a serious error in judgment. Elias remained exactly where he had been standing since 9:12 p.m. He hadn't moved toward the seating clusters. He hadn't moved toward the exits. He hadn't moved toward the bar or the bathroom or anywhere else. He simply occupied his space with the kind of stillness that was beginning to look less like passivity and more like strategy. The diplomat who had spoken up earlier approached him cautiously. "I believe we were both at the Geneva summit last year," he said quietly. His voice pitched for privacy despite the obvious attention. "Your presentation on cross-continental rail integration was exceptional. The section on financing mechanisms for emerging markets." "Thank you," Elias interrupted gently but firmly. "But perhaps we should let the verification process complete." The diplomat nodded, understanding immediately. Elias wasn't seeking validation from peers or trying to establish his credentials through social proof. He was deliberately allowing the system to continue its process, to reveal its assumptions and protocols without interference. He was documenting through patience. Daniel returned at 9:21 p.m., moving quickly across the polished floor. His expression was different now, not openly hostile, but guarded in a way that suggested new information had shifted his internal calculations without completely resolving his uncertainty. Behind him came a woman in a navy suit, her stride purposeful but controlled. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant French twist that suggested both professionalism and personal style. Her heels clicked precisely on the travertine, expensive shoes worn by someone who walked through high-stakes environments regularly. Her badge identified her as Christina Laurent, Senior Airport Operations Director. She took in the scene with the kind of rapid assessment that comes from years of crisis management. The filming guests, the uncomfortable security personnel, the quiet black executive standing at the center of it all with perfect composure. Her eyes lingered on the phones, on the live stream, on the growing audience that had transformed a private incident into public documentation. "Mr. Mensah," she said, her voice carrying natural authority without aggression. "I apologize for the confusion. It was the first time anyone from airport staff had used his name." "Has there been confusion?" Elias asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. Christina's eyes narrowed fractionally. She was experienced enough to recognize that he wasn't making this easy, and sharp enough to understand why. "May I see your documentation?" Elias gestured toward Daniel, who still held the black envelope. Christina took it from him with a slight tension in the movement, a micro-expression that suggested displeasure with how the situation had been handled so far. She opened the envelope fully and spent 30 seconds actually reading the contents. Not skimming, not glancing. Reading with the attention of someone who understood that details mattered and that assumptions had consequences. Her expression shifted as she processed the information. Not dramatically. She was too practiced for obvious reactions, but there was a tightening around her eyes, a slight pursing of her lips that indicated calculations being rapidly revised. "I see," she said quietly. She looked up at Elias, then at Daniel, then back to the document. "Mr. Reeve, did you verify this documentation before attempting removal?" Daniel's face went from guarded to pale in the space of a heartbeat. "It could have been forged," he said, but the defense sounded weak even to his own ears. "Could have been," Christina repeated, her voice carrying a particular edge that only comes from upper management confronting operational failure. "But you didn't check." She pulled out her own tablet from the slim leather portfolio she'd been carrying under her arm. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, navigating through what appeared to be internal airport systems. Access database shows Elias K. Mensah registered as executive sponsor, Tier 1 classification, with unrestricted facility access as of 4:30 p.m. this afternoon. She looked at Daniel with an expression that could have frozen water. It also shows that his credentials and VIP status were electronically transmitted to all relevant staff 6 hours ago, including department heads and operations leads. Daniel's face transitioned from pale to ashen. There were multiple briefings today and... Did you review the VIP arrival notifications for this evening?" Christina's question was precise, surgical. Yes or no, Daniel?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "No." The silence that followed Daniel's admission was absolute. Even the ambient sound system seemed to fade into background static. The classical music that had been providing sophisticated atmosphere now felt like mockery, elegant strings playing while a man's professional competence collapsed in real time. Marcus Webb shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, a subtle movement that nonetheless communicated profound discomfort. His hand, which had been resting near his radio, dropped to his side. He was reevaluating everything that had happened in the last 7 minutes, recognizing with growing clarity that he'd been called into a situation that should never have escalated to security involvement in the first place. Sarah, still standing near the reception desk, had gone very still. Her hands, which had been clasped professionally in front of her, now gripped each other with enough pressure that her knuckles showed white against her skin. Christina Laurent closed her eyes briefly, a gesture that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but conveyed years of experience managing institutional failures. When she opened them, her expression had shifted from sharp assessment to controlled crisis management mode. "Mr. Mensah," she said, her voice maintaining its authority while acquiring a new quality of careful respect. "On behalf of Meridian International Airport, I apologize for this treatment. Your access credentials have never been in question. The error was entirely internal." Elias inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the apology without accepting it as resolution. "I appreciate the clarification." I'll personally ensure you're escorted to your preferred location within the facility. That won't be necessary, Elias said, his voice remaining even. I'm precisely where I intended to be. Christina paused, her brow furrowing slightly. You intended to stand here? You weren't trying to access the seating area or the executive lounge facilities. I was waiting, Elias said simply, for systems to catch up to reality. The answer landed with unexpected weight. Several of the watching guests exchanged glances. The woman filming adjusted her phone angle slightly, ensuring she captured Elias's expression as he spoke. The livestream audience had now crossed 10,000 viewers. Comments were flooding in faster than anyone could read them. This is absolutely insane. They literally profiled him. Someone's getting fired. Who is this guy? Anyone know? Why didn't they just check his credentials? This happens every day to black professionals. I want to know how this ends. Christina's tablet buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at it, and whatever she saw there made her inhale sharply through her nose. A controlled breath that suggested the situation was expanding beyond the sky pavilion. What is it? Daniel asked, his voice thin. Christina looked at him with an expression that made clear he'd lost whatever standing he had to ask questions. But she answered anyway, perhaps because the information was about to become public regardless. Airport's executive director is en route from the operations center. Legal counsel is being briefed. And, she paused, her jaw tightening, the International Press Corps covering the Infrastructure Summit has just submitted an official inquiry requesting comment on an incident involving alleged racial profiling at VIP facilities. Daniel's remaining color drained completely. It wasn't. It doesn't matter what you intended. Christina cut him off. It matters what happened. And what happened was documented by multiple witnesses and broadcast to thousands of people in real time. She turned back to Elias. Mr. Mensah, I understand this situation is deeply problematic. I want to assure you that Meridian International takes these matters with absolute seriousness. We're prepared to conduct a full internal review. Of what? Elias asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than combative. Christina blinked. I'm sorry. What exactly will you review? Whether your staff followed their training. Elias gestured toward Daniel and Sarah and Marcus. They did. They followed protocols exactly as designed. Ms. Chun approached someone without visible credentials and asked them to leave. Mr. Reeve escalated when the initial request wasn't immediately complied with. Officer Webb arrived to provide security presence when a code yellow was called. He paused, letting his words settle. They all did their jobs correctly. The problem isn't individual performance. The problem is that the protocols themselves are designed to assume threat based on appearance and to require certain people to prove their presence while others are presumed to belong. The attorney who had been sitting with the tablets earlier stood up from her seat. She was perhaps 45, white, with dark hair pulled back in a professional style and sharp eyes that suggested years of courtroom experience. He's absolutely right, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space. I'm an employment attorney specializing in discrimination cases. What I just witnessed would be considered a textbook example of disparate treatment based on protected characteristics. Christina turned toward her, tension visible in her shoulders. Ma'am, I appreciate your perspective, but nothing, the attorney interrupted. I've been sitting in this lounge for 40 minutes. I watched at least 8 people enter during that time. Some had visible credentials. Some didn't. None of them were approached. None of them were questioned. None of them were asked to leave. She pointed at Elias. He's the only person who was subjected to verification requirements. And the only meaningful difference between him and every other person who entered this space is his race. Another guest spoke up, a black woman in her 30s wearing a burgundy pantsuit, her locks pulled back in an elegant wrap. I came through here an hour ago. The attendant who checked me in asked to see my access card 3 times. 3. Meanwhile, the man behind me, white guy, expensive suit, walked right past with just a nod. The diplomat added his voice. I've traveled through this facility quarterly for 5 years. I've never once been asked to present credentials in the Sky Pavilion itself. The assumption has always been that if you're in the space, you belong there. The accumulation of voices, of perspectives, of documented observations was building into something larger than any single incident. Christina's tablet buzzed again and again. Messages were arriving in rapid succession now, each one presumably escalating the institutional response to what was no longer just a local situation but an expanding crisis. The elevator chimed. Everyone turned. The doors opened to reveal 4 people in business attire. A man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of executive authority. A woman carrying a leather portfolio embossed with legal letterhead. Another woman with the polished appearance of corporate communications, and a younger black woman whose badge identified her as Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. The executive director of Meridian International Airport had arrived. And behind them, visible through the glass elevator walls as it descended again, was another group. Dr. Amara Okonkwo and the summit coordination team, moving with the urgent purpose of people who had just realized their keynote speaker was being detained 3 floors below their event. The executive director's eyes found Christina first, then tracked to Daniel, then to the security officer, then finally settled on Elias K. Mensa standing calm and composed at the center of the documented chaos, and in that moment everyone in the Sky Pavilion understood. This was no longer about one man being asked to leave one space. This was about systems revealing themselves under pressure, and what happened next would determine whether recognition led to actual change or just better worded apologies. Richard Castellano had been executive director of Meridian International Airport for 11 years. He had navigated labor strikes, security breaches, natural disasters that grounded entire fleets, diplomatic incidents involving heads of state, and one memorable crisis involving a celebrity's emotional support peacock. He had testified before congressional committees, negotiated with international aviation authorities, and managed crises that could have destroyed careers or cost lives. But as he stepped out of the elevator into the Sky Pavilion at 9:24 p.m. on a Thursday evening, reading the scene before him with decades of institutional experience, he understood immediately that this situation was different. This wasn't a problem that could be managed through standard protocols. This was a system revealing its fundamental design flaws in real time, documented by thousands of observers, with implications that extended far beyond one incident at one airport. His eyes completed their assessment in seconds. Christina Laurent standing rigid with professional composure, barely containing visible stress. Daniel Reeve looking like a man watching his career collapse. Sarah Chun at the reception desk, pale and shaken. Marcus Webb positioned uncertainly near a black man in his 40s who stood with perfect stillness at the center of everything. And the phones. Multiple phones. Recording everything. Behind Richard came his crisis team. Patricia Reeves, Chief Legal Officer, already pulling out her tablet to document everything being said. Karen Chun, Communications Director, her expression carefully neutral while her mind was undoubtedly calculating media strategies. And Jennifer Santos, VP of Diversity and Inclusion, whose presence signaled that leadership understood the racial dimensions of what had occurred, even if no one had spoken them aloud yet. "Mr. Mensah?" Richard said, moving forward with his hand extended. His voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had defused countless tense situations. "Richard Castellano, Executive Director. I sincerely apologize for this situation." Elias looked at the offered hand for a beat longer than social convention suggested was comfortable. Long enough to communicate that automatic politeness wasn't going to resolve what had happened, before shaking it. The gesture was civil but not warm. "I appreciate you coming personally," Elias said. "I'm told there was a misunderstanding regarding your access credentials," Richard continued, his language carefully chosen to frame the incident as mutual confusion rather than institutional failure. "There was no misunderstanding," Elias corrected, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect space. "There was an assumption, followed by multiple refusals to verify when documentation was provided." Patricia Reeves stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise word choices. "Mr. Mensah, I want to assure you that Meridian International takes matters of this nature with absolute seriousness. We're prepared to conduct a comprehensive internal review." "Of what?" Elias asked, and the question stopped her mid-sentence. "I'm sorry," What exactly will you review? Elias elaborated. Whether your staff followed protocol. They did. Every step of what happened tonight was consistent with your training and procedures. The issue isn't individual failure. The issue is that your systems are designed to treat certain presentations as threats requiring verification, while others are presumed legitimate. The attorney who had spoken up earlier was nodding. Several other guests were watching with expressions that suggested they'd never considered the architecture of assumption that governed elite spaces. Patricia recovered her professional composure. Mr. Mensah, our protocols are designed to ensure security for all guests. Your protocols, Elias interrupted gently, assume threat based on appearance. They require certain people to prove they belong while others are granted automatic acceptance. That's not security architecture. That's social sorting disguised as safety procedure. Jennifer Santos, the diversity VP, spoke carefully. Mr. Mensah, we've implemented extensive anti-bias training programs across all departments. And yet, Elias said, gesturing around the Sky Pavilion at the assembled staff and witnesses. Here we are. Jennifer's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. What could she say? The evidence was standing before her, documented and broadcast. The elevator chimed again. Dr. Amara Okonkwo emerged first, moving with the controlled urgency of someone managing a crisis that directly threatened an event she'd spent months organizing. Behind her came two assistants, both carrying tablets and moving with synchronized efficiency. Dr. Okonkwo's eyes found Elias immediately. Her expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and alarm in rapid succession. Elias, she said, her Nigerian accent more pronounced in her surprise. What are you? Why are you out here? Apparently, Elias replied with faint irony. Not belonging. Dr. Okonkwo turned sharply to Richard. Are you aware that Mr. Mensah is not just a summit participant? He's our primary keynote speaker. He represents the Pan-Continental Transit Consortium as their lead executive for African infrastructure development. His presentation tonight includes security classified materials that only he is authorized to present. Richard's expression remained professionally neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation of stakes, consequences, and exposure. We've just confirmed his credentials, Christina began. Just confirmed. Dr. Okonkwo's voice rose slightly, her professional composure cracking. She pulled out her own tablet, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. His information was distributed to all airport personnel at 3 p.m. this afternoon. His security clearance level is higher than most government delegates attending the summit. He has unrestricted access to every facility in this airport, including operational areas that even I cannot enter without escort. One of her assistants leaned in, whispering urgently. Dr. Okonkwo's eyes widened. And this is being live-streamed? Right now. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone slightly, as if only now fully comprehending the implications of what she'd captured and shared. How many viewers? Dr. Okonkwo asked, her voice tight. The assistant checked her device. Current count shows 16,000. The video has been shared across multiple platforms. News aggregators are picking it up. We're seeing engagement from journalists covering the summit. Dr. Okonkwo closed her eyes briefly, a gesture of someone calculating cascading consequences across multiple domains. When she opened them, she looked at Elias with something between apology and frustration. You could have said something. You could have told them who you were. I did say something, Elias replied calmly. Multiple times. To multiple people. What I didn't do was prove myself when the burden of proof should never have been placed on me. The diplomat who had recognized Elias earlier spoke up. He presented documentation that was dismissed without proper review. Because the assumption had already been made, added the attorney, her legal mind clearly cataloging every detail for potential future use. Let's not pretend we don't all understand what actually happened here. A black executive with completely valid credentials was interrogated, questioned, and threatened with removal while every other person in this space, she gestured around at the predominantly white guests, was simply presumed to belong. The black woman in the burgundy pantsuit stood as well. I've been in corporate America for 15 years. I've been the only black woman in countless rooms. And what I just witnessed is something I experience regularly. Being asked to prove my presence in spaces where others are automatically accepted. More voices began joining. A Latino man in tech casual. I've had similar experiences at conferences. The assumption that you must be support staff, not a participant. An Asian woman near the piano. Or the surprise when you're actually the keynote speaker, not the translator. The accumulation of perspectives was building into something larger than Elias's individual experience. A collective recognition of patterns that had been invisible to some and brutally familiar to others. Richard's phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Patricia's as well. Karen's communications device was lighting up with notifications. "What's happening?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. Karen glanced at her screen, her expression tightening. The hashtag Skypavilion incident is trending regionally. International media outlets are requesting official statements. And, she paused, her professional composure showing strain. Several delegates attending the summit are posting their own experiences with discriminatory treatment at various airports and professional venues. Patricia looked at Richard. "We need to contain this before." "Before what?" Elias asked quietly. "Before consequences occur? Before accountability becomes unavoidable?" Richard met Elias's eyes, and in that moment understood that this was not a man seeking settlement or silence. This was someone who had deliberately allowed a system to reveal itself, who had documented institutional failure through patient endurance, and who now held institutional power accountable not through aggression but through the simple act of refusing to disappear. Richard Castellano had built a career on reading people and situations. He understood immediately that standard crisis management wouldn't work here. Elias Mensah wasn't looking for compensation or apologies that would make the problem go away. He was doing something far more strategic, forcing the system to confront its own design. "Mr. Mensah," Richard said carefully, "what would you like to see happen?" It was the first genuinely open question anyone from airport leadership had asked. Not a question designed to guide toward a predetermined outcome, but actual inquiry into what justice might look like. Elias was quiet for a moment, considering. Outside the glass walls, a private jet began its takeoff roll, engines building to thrust, lights cutting through the darkness. Inside the Sky Pavilion, 16,000 people watched via livestream, waiting to see how power responded when it was documented failing. "I want documentation," Elias said finally. "Complete, thorough documentation of this incident. Not an internal memo that disappears into HR files that no one outside leadership ever sees. A formal incident report, publicly available, detailing exactly what occurred, when, and why." Patricia tensed visibly. Public disclosure was the opposite of standard legal strategy. "Mr. Mensah, public documentation would require accountability," Elias finished. "Yes, exactly. Our legal counsel would typically advise." "I'm not interested in what typically happens," Elias said, his voice remaining calm but carrying new weight. "I'm interested in what should happen. Transparency, documentation, truth." He continued before anyone could interrupt. "I want mandatory external review of your VIP access protocols. Not more training sessions where staff are told to examine their unconscious biases while the actual systems remain unchanged. Structural review by consultants with specific expertise in equitable access design." Jennifer Santos was taking notes rapidly on her tablet, her stylus moving across the screen. "And I want a commitment in writing signed by executive leadership that this incident will be used as a case study in identifying and correcting systemic bias. Not buried as an embarrassing anomaly. Not minimized as a misunderstanding. Used as an example of how assumptions become embedded in institutional design." The specificity of his requests revealed something important. Elias had been thinking about systemic change long before tonight. This incident was one example of patterns he'd observed across industries, institutions, and continents. Richard exchanged glances with his legal and communications teams. The calculation was visible in their expressions. Legal exposure versus reputational damage, internal resistance versus external pressure, The cost of compliance versus the cost of refusal. We can agree to internal documentation, Richard said cautiously, but public disclosure raises concerns about. The attorney laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. You think you have a choice at this point? There are currently 18,000 people watching this conversation. The footage is already distributed across platforms you cannot control. Screenshots are being saved. Recordings are being downloaded. The only question is whether you shape the narrative through transparency or whether others shape it through speculation about what you're trying to hide. Richard's expression tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being spoken to that way, particularly not in front of his own staff and multiple witnesses. But he was also experienced enough to recognize truth when it was delivered sharply. Dr. Okonkwo's assistant spoke up urgently. Dr. Okonkwo, the summit chair, is requesting immediate status update. The opening ceremony is now 18 minutes delayed. They need to know whether to restructure the entire program or continue holding for Mr. Mensah. Dr. Okonkwo looked at Elias, and in her eyes was a complex mixture of professional concern and personal respect. Elias, what do you need from me? I need you to understand, Elias said, his voice carrying across the space with quiet intensity, that this isn't about ego or revenge or making people uncomfortable. This is about ensuring that the next person who stands where I'm standing doesn't have to be important enough to stop an international summit before they're treated with basic dignity. The words landed with profound weight. The Sky Pavilion went completely silent. Even the ambient music seemed to fade into nothing. The thousands watching via livestream paused their commenting, sensing something significant was happening. Christina Lauron, who had been quiet since the executive team arrived, finally spoke. Mr. Mensah is right. Her voice was steady but carried emotion beneath the professional surface. I've reviewed the security footage from tonight. Our staff acted according to their training. They followed procedures exactly as designed. The problem isn't individual failure. It's that our training and procedures themselves embed assumptions about who belongs and who must prove their presence. Richard turned to her with an expression that suggested she was breaking ranks at the worst possible moment. No, Christina continued, her voice firming. He's about to walk into a summit where he'll discuss infrastructure integrity, systemic efficiency, and sustainable development. How do we expect him to speak credibly about designing systems that serve everyone when our own systems just failed him publicly and systematically? Jennifer Santos nodded slowly. She's right. This isn't an isolated incident. It's evidence of design flaws we've been aware of but haven't prioritized addressing. Richard's phone buzzed again, a longer vibration pattern that indicated a call rather than a message. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted. Excuse me, he said, stepping several feet away to answer. His voice was low, but in the acoustic environment of the Sky Pavilion, fragments carried, Yes, I understand. The board is watching. I'm aware of the exposure. We're working toward resolution. When he returned, his expression had changed. Not defeated, but recalibrated. That was our board chair, he said. The board of directors has been monitoring the livestream. They're requesting immediate resolution that prioritizes institutional accountability over defensive posturing. He looked at Elias directly. Mr. Mensah, Meridian International Airport accepts full responsibility for tonight's events. We commit to the measures you've outlined. Comprehensive public documentation, external protocol review with equity-focused consultants, and transparent case study development for systemic improvement. Patricia looked like she wanted to object but recognized the decision had been made above her authority level. Richard continued, More than that, we commit to examining the structural assumptions embedded throughout our access and security systems. Because you're correct. This isn't about one staff member making one mistake. It's about systems designed with assumptions that make certain people prove their presence while presuming others belong. Dr. Okonkwo checked her watch and said quietly, Elias, the summit cannot proceed without you. Literally cannot proceed, as your presentation includes classified infrastructure plans that are foundational to every discussion that follows. And in that moment, everyone understood. This was not simply a black executive who had been wrongly questioned. This was the architect of continental infrastructure development, The man 23 nations were waiting for, the person whose vision would shape billions of dollars in investment, and the Sky Pavilion had tried to remove him based on nothing more than the assumption that he couldn't possibly be that important. The recognition spread through the Sky Pavilion like temperature change, subtle but undeniable. The diplomat's expression shifted from supportive curiosity to something approaching awe. You're that Mensa, the Cross-Continental Rail Integration Framework, the Sustainable Port Development Initiative, the Pan-African Logistics Corridor. He spoke as if naming sacred texts. The tech entrepreneur near the bar pulled out his phone, not to record but to search, and his face went pale as search results populated his screen. Oh my God! He advised on the Singapore-Jakarta Infrastructure Partnership. He structured the financing for the East African Rail expansion. His consortium manages $70 billion in active infrastructure projects. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone completely now, the enormity of what she documented finally registering. She hadn't just captured a man being racially profiled. She'd captured a titan of global infrastructure development being told he didn't belong in an airport VIP lounge. But Elias's expression hadn't changed. He didn't smile with vindication. He didn't show satisfaction at the recognition. If anything, he looked slightly weary, as if this pattern, being doubted, then recognized, then apologized to, was exhaustingly familiar. The summit begins in 14 minutes, Dr. Okonkwo said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. The opening remarks cannot proceed without you. Your presentation includes security-coded projections that only you can authorize for display. Ministers are seated. Delegates are waiting. We have international press coverage scheduled to begin at. I understand the stakes, Elias said quietly. I understood them when I was standing here being asked to leave. The statement hung in the air with devastating simplicity. Richard cleared his throat. Mr. Mensah, we've agreed to your terms. What else do you need before I perform as if nothing happened? Elias asked. His voice wasn't angry, just precise. Before I walk into a room full of global leaders and present infrastructure vision, while the institution hosting the event just demonstrated that it can't correctly identify who should be in its own spaces? Richard had no good answer to that. Patricia stepped forward, her legal training visible in her careful language. Mr. Mensah, we'll draft a formal agreement outlining our commitments within 48 hours. You'll have full approval rights over the language. The document will be filed with our regulatory oversight bodies and made available for public review. I appreciate that, Elias said. Then he turned to Christina. Ms. Loron, I'd like to request that the staff involved in tonight's incident not be terminated. The request surprised everyone. Christina's eyes widened. Daniel, who had been standing rigidly near the elevator bank expecting the worst, looked up sharply. Sarah made a small sound of shock. Instead, Elias continued, I'd like them included in the protocol redesign process. They followed their training. Their perspective on where that training failed them, where it put them in a position to make assumptions rather than verify facts, will be valuable in rebuilding better systems. It was an act of grace that was simultaneously strategic brilliance. By protecting the staff, Elias removed the easy narrative of individual bad actors being punished while keeping focus exactly where it belonged, on systemic change. Daniel's eyes were bright with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. Sarah had pressed her hand against her mouth. That's... Christina searched for words. That's extraordinarily generous. It's strategic, Elias corrected gently. Firing people creates martyrs and allows institutions to claim the problem is solved. Keeping them engaged in the solution ensures that the people who experienced the system's flaws firsthand can help redesign it. Perhaps this is a good moment to pause and ask yourself something. If you were in that lounge tonight, not as Elias but as one of the other guests, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up when you first noticed the questioning? Or would you have stayed silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to make things awkward? It's easy to imagine ourselves as heroes in stories like this. It's harder to acknowledge how often we've been bystanders. How often we've seen someone treated differently and convinced ourselves there must be a legitimate reason. How often we've chosen our own comfort over someone else's dignity. If this story is making you think about your own choices, about the systems you participate in, about the times you've assumed rather than verified, then please take a moment to like this video. Not because I'm asking for engagement, but because stories like this only reach the people who need to hear them when others choose to amplify them. Subscribe if you believe these conversations matter. And leave a comment about what you would have done, or what you've witnessed, or what you're committing to do differently. Because the distance between this story and real change is measured in people who feel something and then choose to act. Marcus Webb, the security officer, cleared his throat. "Mr. Mensah, I apologize. I responded to a code yellow without asking enough questions. I should have." His voice caught slightly. "I should have verified before assuming." Elias looked at him with something approaching kindness. "Officer Webb, you were called to a situation and responded according to your training. The failure wasn't yours personally. But I appreciate your willingness to examine your own actions." Jennifer Santos spoke up. "Mr. Mensah, I want to be transparent with you. I've been VP of Diversity and Inclusion here for 3 years. We've implemented training programs, revised hiring practices, created reporting mechanisms. And tonight still happened. That means our efforts have been insufficient. Not insincere, but insufficient." "Thank you for acknowledging that," Elias said. "The difference between performance and transformation is exactly that kind of honest assessment." Richard checked his watch. "The summit can begin," Elias agreed. "But I need one more thing." "What?" "I need you to understand that this conversation doesn't end when I walk upstairs. The documentation, the review, the structural changes, those commitments have to survive beyond tonight's crisis. Because systems protect themselves. They absorb criticism, make temporary adjustments, and then gradually revert to their comfortable defaults. The real test of whether anything changes will come in 6 months, in a year, when media attention has moved elsewhere and the easier path is to let reforms quietly fade." Richard met his eyes. "We won't let that happen. Make sure it's not just you," Elias said. "Make it structural, not personal. Personal commitments leave with people. Structural changes remain." Dr. Okonkwo's phone buzzed urgently. She glanced at it and winced. "Elias, I hate to push, but we're now 21 minutes delayed. If we don't start soon, we'll lose our international broadcast window." Elias nodded. "I'm ready." "Thank you," Dr. Okonkwo said, relief flooding her voice. "Don't thank me yet," Elias replied with the faintest smile. "My keynote address just acquired a new opening section." Several people laughed. Genuine laughter that broke tension without dismissing gravity. As they moved toward the elevator, the woman who had been filming spoke up. "Mr. Mensah, I recorded everything. I can take it down if you want privacy, or I can leave it up as documentation." Elias looked at her thoughtfully, then at the phone that had captured his humiliation and dignity in equal measure, and said, "Leave it up. Not as entertainment, but as evidence that these moments happen, that they're survivable, and that speaking truth to power doesn't require shouting." And with that, the documentation of the Sky Pavilion incident remained publicly accessible, a permanent record that would be viewed millions of times, studied in business schools, analyzed in diversity training, cited in policy discussions, and remembered as the night assumptions became visible. The walk to the summit level took 90 seconds. The elevator descended in silence, carrying Elias, Dr. Okonkwo, Richard, Christina, and Jennifer. The polished steel walls reflected their figures in slightly distorted proportions, shadow versions of themselves, warped by curved metal. Elias stood near the back, his reflection visible beside the others. His expression remained neutral, revealing nothing of what he felt beneath the composed exterior. 47 years of navigating predominantly white professional spaces had taught him the value of controlled presentation. Not performance exactly, more like careful curation of what others were permitted to see. The doors opened onto the summit level. The infrastructure conference was being held in the airport's premier event complex, a space specifically designed for international gatherings requiring the highest security protocols. The corridor stretched wide and high, walls lined with flags representing the 23 participating nations. Security personnel stood at regular intervals, their presence professional but not oppressive. Through glass walls, delegates were visible in the main conference hall, seated in tiered arrangements facing an empty stage. The lighting was broadcast quality, bright, even designed for live streaming to audiences across multiple continents. Camera crews had their equipment trained on the podium where opening remarks would begin. A production assistant met them immediately, headset wrapped around her neck, clipboard in hand. Dr. Okonkwo, we're 23 minutes delayed. Network affiliates are requesting confirmation on whether we're proceeding with the original schedule or restructuring. Original schedule, Dr. Okonkwo said firmly. Adjust the networking reception timing to compensate. Everything else proceeds as planned. The assistant nodded, speaking rapidly into her headset as she walked alongside them. Dr. Okonkwo turned to Elias. Your presentation materials are loaded. Audio is tested. Your introduction is prepared. We're ready when you are. Elias nodded. Give me 2 minutes. He stepped away from the group, moving to a quiet alcove near the glass walls overlooking the conference hall. From this vantage point, he could see the assembled crowd. Ministers of transportation, infrastructure ministers, representatives from development banks, private sector executives, environmental scientists, urban planners. Hundreds of professionals who had traveled thousands of miles to discuss billions of dollars in infrastructure investment. And somewhere in those hundreds of faces were others like him. People who had stood in rooms where their presence was questioned. People who had been asked to prove belonging that others were granted automatically. People who navigated professional spaces while carrying the exhausting awareness that they were being evaluated not just on competence but on whether they fit preconceived notions of who belongs in positions of authority. Christina appeared beside him. Mr. Mensah, she said quietly, I want you to know that what happened tonight will change how we operate, not because of liability concerns or media pressure, but because it should have changed long ago and we failed to recognize that. Ms. Loron, Elias replied, I believe you mean that, but intention and implementation are different things. Systems resist change because they're comfortable for those they serve. The real question is whether your discomfort tonight is sufficient to sustain the hard work of structural transformation over months and years, not just days. We won't let it fade, Christina said. Make sure you're not the only one holding that commitment, Elias advised, because personal commitments leave with people. Structural changes remain only when they're embedded so deeply that they become the new default. Jennifer joined them. Mr. Mensah, I've already scheduled our first external audit for next week. I'd like to request your participation in the redesign process, if you're willing. Not as a consultant we pay to validate our work, but as an authentic voice in transformation. I'll consider it, Elias said, but understand, I won't participate in anything that becomes performance rather than genuine change. I won't be the black face that legitimizes inadequate reform. Understood, Jennifer said, meeting his eyes with what appeared to be genuine commitment. A summit coordinator approached. Mr. Mensah, they're ready for you. Elias K. Mensah straightened his blazer, checked his reflection one final time in the glass, and walked toward the stage. Not as a man who had just been humiliated, but as the person 23 nations had been waiting for, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that what happened in the Sky Pavilion would echo far longer than anything he said in his keynote address. Elias K. Mensah walked onto the stage at 9:52 p.m. The applause was immediate and sustained, though whether it was for his professional reputation, his scheduled presentation, or the fact that he had appeared at all after the documented incident remained impossible to parse. He stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on its edges, and waited for silence. The room settled. Conversations faded. Camera operators adjusted their equipment for optimal framing. Somewhere across the world, live streams carried his image to screens in offices, homes, universities, and government buildings. Good evening, he began, his voice clear and measured, amplified perfectly by the sound system. My name is Elias K. Mensah. I represent the Pan-Continental Transit Consortium, and I was scheduled to open tonight's summit with a presentation on integrated rail systems across emerging markets. He paused deliberately. That presentation will still occur. But I'm going to begin somewhere different. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience like wind across water. 51 minutes ago, I was asked to leave a VIP area in this facility. Not because I lacked credentials. Not because I posed a security threat. But because someone looked at me and made an assumption about whether I belonged. The room went completely still. Several delegates leaned forward. Others exchanged glances. Camera operators kept their equipment trained on Elias, recognizing they were capturing something unscripted and significant. I'm sharing this not to embarrass anyone or center my own experience above the work we're here to do. I'm sharing it because what happened to me illustrates something fundamental about the systems we've gathered to discuss tonight. He gestured toward the flags lining the walls. Infrastructure, whether physical or social, functions on embedded assumptions. Roads are built with assumptions about who will travel them. Buildings are designed with assumptions about who will enter them. Access systems operate on assumptions about who belongs and who must prove their presence. This summit represents nations at vastly different development stages, with different resources, different priorities, different histories. The infrastructure we design together over these next 3 days will shape cities and economies for decades. And if we don't examine the assumptions embedded in our planning, assumptions about who uses infrastructure, whose needs are centered, whose presence is presumed versus whose must be proven, then we will reproduce existing inequities at architectural scale. Delegates were nodding now. Some looked uncomfortable, which Elias recognized as equally valuable. Tonight, an airport security system treated me exactly as it was designed to. The staff followed their training. The protocols were executed correctly. The problem wasn't individual malice. It was systematic design that treats certain presentations as requiring verification while others are granted automatic acceptance. He pulled up the first slide of his presentation, a map showing proposed rail connections across East Africa, rendered in elegant detail. Now, let's talk about building systems that actually serve everyone they're meant to include. The presentation ran 78 minutes. Questions extended another 25. When Elias finally left the stage, the response was more than applause. It was animated conversation, delegates clustering in groups, discussing not just rail systems but the implications of his opening remarks. Some conversations would be uncomfortable. Some would lead to policy changes. Some would fade into the background noise of good intentions that never materialize into action. But some, a critical few, would lead to structural transformation. That night, in hotels and conference rooms and airport lounges across the city, people had conversations they hadn't planned to have. About assumptions, about belonging, about the difference between diversity performance and equity transformation. 3 months later, Meridian International Airport completed its external protocol review. The findings were published in full, unredacted, available for public review. 12 specific policy changes were implemented. Training was restructured from bias awareness to systemic design thinking. 6 months later, 17 other major airports had requested copies of the review to inform their own reforms. 1 year later, the Sky Pavilion incident was being studied in business schools as a case study in how documentation, patience, and strategic communication could force institutional accountability without requiring legal action or public destruction. But that night, as the summit's networking reception continued floors above, Elias stood once more near the glass walls overlooking the runway. Private jets departed in scheduled sequences, their lights cutting through darkness, ascending toward destinations unknown. The Sky Pavilion above remained visible, amber glow unchanged, furniture precisely arranged, ready to receive its next round of guests. Tomorrow there would be more meetings, more presentations, more infrastructure negotiations that would shape development across continents. But something had shifted. Not in the lighting or the architecture or even the written policies, not yet. In the awareness, in the recognition that systems reveal themselves under pressure, and that documentation matters, and that dignity isn't something people should have to prove but something spaces should be designed to presume. Elias thought about Daniel Reeve wherever he was now, about Sarah Chin, about Marcus Webb, about all the staff who had acted according to their training and found themselves confronting the limitations of that training. None of them were villains. All of them were parts of systems larger than themselves. And systems, Elias understood, changed not through individual enlightenment alone but through structural redesign that made dignity the default rather than an earned privilege. He checked his phone. 23 messages. 62 emails. 8 interview requests from major media outlets. He responded to none of them yet. Instead, he sent a single text to his daughter, who was studying civil engineering at Howard University. Remember what I told you about structures. They only hold what they're designed to hold. Design better. The response came quickly. Always, Dad. Proud of you. Elias smiled. Outside, another jet lifted into darkness, ascending toward tomorrow. Inside, the work of rebuilding systems continued. Both would take time. Both would require persistence. Both were necessary. And somewhere in the sky pavilion above, the assumptions were different now. Not fixed, not solved, but visible in ways they hadn't been before. Which was always where change began.